Beatings that never stopped until their bones were broken. Bodies hung by their wrists until the tendons tore. Feet forced to walk on burning embers while screams mixed with the smell of charred flesh. Burns with red-hot irons. Brutal mutilations without anesthesia and castrations that left the victims bleeding on the ground. These were some of the horrible tortures that took place in the concentration camps. In these large-scale cages that often served as cemeteries, the punishments not only sought to destroy the body, but to crush the spirit of the prisoners. Everyone suffered horrific punishments, even the smallest children.
When the children began to cry from hunger, the Nazi guards, so they would not be irritated, simply killed them. Another, even more terrible entertainment was the murders in front of the mothers. The Nazis grabbed small children by the legs, spun them in the air, and beat their heads against a wall or a pillar with all their might.
Imagine a place where suffering is endless, where pain is meticulously calculated. A place where the screams of the victims are not an alarm signal, but music to the ears of their torturers. This is what Nazi concentration camps were like. Factories of horror, laboratories where the limits of human cruelty were tested. In this military history video, we will explore the most brutal punishments and unimaginable atrocities suffered by the victims of the concentration camps. A journey through the deepest abyss of humanity. Let's begin.
Some SS guards would get imaginative when devising new methods of punishment. Edward August, an SS guard, was infamous for being constantly drunk on duty. He was used to scaring other guards with his methods of torture. He would kick his victims in sensitive places frequently, bury them in boxes of sand, dunk their heads in a barrel of water, and hang them upside down by their legs on a chain to then lower them slowly into a tank of used car lubricant.
This is one of the many macabre anecdotes left to us by the infamous Nazi camps. Between 1933 and 1945, during the rise and fall of the regime led by Adolf Hitler, Germany built a terrifying network of more than 42,000 concentration, extermination, forced labor, and detention camps. These places were not only instruments of political and social control, but veritable machines of suffering designed to eliminate and degrade millions of people. While the majority were made up of Jews, there were also gypsies, prisoners of war, political opponents, people with disabilities, and homosexuals, among others. All were sent under the promise of work or re-education, only to find a fate marked by hunger, torture, and in many cases, death.
And this is what they ordered us to do. Walk over to the sawhorse, tiptoe, bend over, but your stomach cannot touch a 2x4. Your heel cannot touch the ground. One man is pulling your trousers tight, the other one does the hitting. You have to count out loud. If you miscount, you start from 1 again.
In the Sachsenhausen medical barracks, cruelty reached unimaginable levels. Here, human bodies were treated as mere objects for experimentation. Prisoners weakened by hunger and forced labor were randomly selected for atrocious tests, amputations without anesthesia, injections of lethal poisons, and experiments with deadly diseases. The screams of those who still had the strength to resist were quickly silenced in this place where science had become an instrument of torture. All this occurred under the impassive gaze of the guards and doctors, who noted the results with chilling precision. But the horror did not end there. Those who survived these tests were abandoned to their fate or killed to hide the evidence. This camp was not only a place of death, but a laboratory of terror, a space where humanity was completely blurred in favor of a system of extermination and suffering.
On one side, there were disciplinary punishments. You could get up to 25 blows with a stick, but on the other, you could also be sentenced to death.
Leather-reinforced whips were common tools. Each blow tore the skin and left bloody furrows on the back, arms, or legs. But the methods were varied. Sometimes guards used wooden batons, metal paddles, or simply the butts of their rifles. It was common for prisoners to be forced to kneel, with their hands behind their heads while receiving blows one after another. At Dachau, prisoners were subjected to a particularly sadistic practice, the torture circuit. Here, they were made to run barefoot on sharp gravel while guards attacked them with metal rods. Those who fell were dragged along the ground and beaten until they lost consciousness. Again and again, the Nazis took turns so that the spectacle of pain was not interrupted.
Here, the number of sadistic entertainments of the Nazis is also almost unrealistic. The most harmless was when the guards, having chosen several people who they didn't like, gave the commands lie down or crawl. Moreover, the command had to be executed immediately, otherwise followed by a severe beating to death or execution.
Another of the most feared punishments was strappado hanging, a technique designed not only to inflict excruciating pain, but to physically break the victim. Prisoners were hung by their wrists, with their arms tied behind their backs. In this position, their shoulders were almost immediately dislocated, and the weight of the body tore at muscles and tendons. The screams of the victims were so terrible that many prisoners said they preferred immediate death. Sometimes this punishment was carried out publicly. Other inmates were forced to watch as the victims struggled to breathe, suspended in the air like broken dolls. Those who survived were often left with permanent arm injuries, unable to work or even move normally. An even more macabre method was to hang prisoners by their feet, with their heads down for hours. This procedure caused uncontrolled blood flow to the brain, leading to internal bleeding, loss of sight, and, in many cases, death by asphyxiation or aneurysm. The bodies were then disposed of as garbage, while guards celebrated a job well done.
Living there were another 7 layers of hell. A lot of Jewish inmates would be left unattended in dark, damp cells with no food, water, or clothes. The SS would use these cells to simply torture or send the message to the whole inmate population. But these were dark cells, and then there were dark cells. The cells officially called dark cells contained no light and were sealed shut with prisoners inside who would be left with very little oxygen. Oxygen would reduce with every breath the inmate takes, giving them no escape from a slow, impending, and inevitable.
In addition to darkness, fire was turned into an instrument of unimaginable cruelty inside these cells. In camps such as, guards used red-hot irons to burn prisoners' skin. These irons were applied directly to the back, chest, or palms of the hands. In other cases, torches were used to char specific parts of the body, such as the face or genitals. The guards, many of them drunk with alcohol and power, enjoyed the expressions of agony of their victims. Sometimes, prisoners were forced to hold red-hot pieces of metal with their bare hands, under threat of being executed if they let go. One witness described how a particularly cruel technique was used in Auschwitz. Guards forced prisoners to walk barefoot over burning embers. Those who failed to cross the path were pushed back to the start, repeating the punishment until their feet were completely charred. Jewish women were subject to a special punishment from Nazi soldiers: systematic rape. This was very common in the camps. Those who survived the horror carried the weight of shame and trauma in a place where dignity had already been uprooted.
Drunken Nazis flew into the barracks with the help of the flashlights, chose the girls they liked the most, and often immediately began them on the spot. If it turned out that the girl was a virgin, then the guards called their colleagues on the new body so that they could get special pleasure.
Another common practice was mutilation, used as punishment and as part of pseudoscientific experiments. At Ravensbrück, a camp known for housing mostly women, female prisoners were subjected to brutal operations in which their limbs were amputated without anesthesia. Often, these amputations were not medically necessary, but were a form of entertainment for the Nazi doctors, who watched as the victims writhed in pain. The women were welcomed into a living hell. Screams echoed as numbers were tattooed on their skin like cattle, erasing their names forever. The entire system was designed to break them from the first moment. The humiliation, the biting cold, the beatings, and the sight of the crematoriums in the background served as a cruel warning of their final fate.
We were herded into a huge hall and told to undress. And then somebody came and shaved all our hair. And then we were herded into another room where we were sat on benches like in a theater stacked.
Men, especially in camps like Mauthausen, had their fingers or hands amputated as punishment for trying to steal food or for disobedience. The tools used for these mutilations were often rudimentary: dull knives, rusty saws, or even carpentry tools. The wounds were rarely treated, leading to serious infections that led to a slow, agonizing death. But there was one barbarity that both men and women suffered: forced sterilization. The Nazis, obsessed with the idea of racial purity, implemented programs designed to make sure that undesirable populations could not reproduce. For women, this meant brutal operations in which their ovaries were removed or they were injected with chemicals that destroyed their reproductive system. Often, these interventions were carried out without anesthesia, in unsanitary conditions, leading to deadly infections. For men, castration was the primary method. This procedure involved the use of knives, scissors, or even sharp stones to remove genitals. Many men bled to death, while others were forced to continue working until their bodies succumbed to pain and infection. One of the most sadistic experiments involved exposing prisoners to sub-zero temperatures to study hypothermia. Inmates were forced to submerge themselves in tanks of ice-cold water, while doctors watched as their bodies slowly froze. They often died of hypothermia, while the Nazis recorded the results. The poor food in the concentration camps was another tool of torture, slower and more merciless. Each bite was a fight against the hunger that devoured their insides, even if the food was disgusting and even vomit-inducing. Eating was not living, it was simply prolonging the torment.
The daily food rations of an average prisoner were scant at best. They were forced to eat bread made of sawdust and sausage made of mangy horses. The lack of nutrition led to many inmates stealing food out of extreme craving, and a lot of them even resorted to eating rotten food from the garbage.
Another experiment involved injecting chemicals into prisoners' eyes, with the aim of changing the color of their irises. This procedure, carried out without anesthetic, caused excruciating pain and often left victims completely blind. Nazi expansion brought not only death, but a legacy of horror that the Allies would discover as they advanced. When the Red Army liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, veteran Ivan Martinushkin witnessed what he described as hell on earth. Between the barbed wire, he found bodies consumed by hunger and living prisoners who were barely shadows, their eyes empty and their humanity stripped away. The ovens still smoked, and the smell of death permeated the air. It was brutal evidence of how far human cruelty can go.
We found exhausted people, their faces and bodies blackened. We didn't know whether we were dealing with young people or the very old. They were in such a terrible state.
The punishments and torture inflicted in the concentration camps are a reminder of how far human evil can go. The victims not only suffered physically, but were stripped of everything that made them people: their dignity, their identity, their hope. Today, as we remember these horrors, we must commit to fighting hatred and intolerance in all its forms. To forget is to allow history to repeat itself, and the world cannot afford another Auschwitz, another Treblinka, another human hell. This is how we come to the end of the video. If you are interested in learning more about World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.